So when I say Capitol Reef, what do I mean? Capitol Reef country is really what this book is about, not just the national park, not just the zigzag straight lines on the park boundary. Here's a regional map, and you can see lots of straight lines, lots of zigzags, and you can see how Capitol Reef is just one protected area among many, surrounded by these national forests, national monuments, and other national parks. I still love this book in my little 1978 booklet about Capitol Reef because it really makes sense out of the geography more than anything else that I know. You can see that zigzag line of the park boundary following the yellow cliffs of the Water Pocket Fold, this wrinkle in the Earth's surface that runs all the way from Thousand Lake Mountain down to the Colorado River at Lake Powell. In between Boulder Mountain, the eastern edge of the Aquarius Plateau, and the Henry Mountains. And so I think of this whole territory here as Capitol Reef country. The literature of Capitol Reef really begins on that eastern rim of Boulder Mountain as you stand there on Highway 12 and look out across the park. The literature of Capitol Reef really begins with Clarence Dutton, waxing eloquent in 1880 as he gazed over the Water Pocket Fold from the rim of Boulder, sent here by John Wesley Powell to study geology, but bowled over by what he called the sublime panorama, the superlative desert. The same view that Wallace Stegner called the geography of hope when he imagined that view when he wrote his famous wilderness letter. I went looking for less famous people too, people that I didn't know about when I began this project. Writers who'd written about that same view, like Michigan writer Linda Elizabeth Peterson, who wrote an essay where she writes movingly of being undone by the view from Boulder Mountain. Way up in the north end of the park, there's a completely different landscape. South Desert and Cathedral Valley. Dry valleys with these buttes standing up from flats, completely different from the big red Navajo sandstone cliffs of the Water Pocket Fold. But it turns out that's a really interesting place in terms of its history of writing. And it goes back actually to the very first book written about Capitol Reef that included the very first photograph taken in Capitol Reef by Solomon Carvalho, who took this picture when he came through in 1854 with John Charles Fremont along the 38th parallel. That picture then turned into an etching for the published version of Fremont's journals, was reproduced 140 years later by a contemporary photographer, Bob Schler, who taught himself how to make daguerreotypes, just like the daguerreotypes that Solomon Carvalho had made. And took a picture of these buttes in Cathedral Valley that we now know as Mom, Pop, and Henry. I also include Carvalho's harrowing account of nearly freezing to death on that expedition through the park to be an excerpt from his 1860 bestseller. Even though this is surely the least visited section of the park, the temples of the sun and moon have become the iconic images of Capitol Reef. I think because of their easily grasped monumentality, because of their graphic boldness. You know, if you've seen one of those RV rentals with New York plates that drives around the west with a big picture of a national park on the side, if it's Capitol Reef, it's going to be the temples of the sun and moon. And I kept reaching out to other writers, especially to younger writers, trying to find pieces that no one was reading. And my inquiry to Anne Marie Vivian turned loose her letter to her grandfather, acknowledging the power and balm of Cathedral Valley, a place her grandfather went to deal with his PTSD after World War II. So Capitol Reef turns out to have a surprisingly rich literature, and it just keeps going. It's a body of work that's alive. And when you read that work, there's a lot of emotion in that work. People use the word love a lot in these words. The editors of the Arches and Bryce Canyon volumes in this National Park Readers series are having a harder time finding the same wealth of writing about their parks. And I think I figured out the reason. You know, Capitol Reef was named because it's a barrier to travel. The word reef doesn't refer to anything oceanic. It's a reef because it's hard to get through. But it's actually more passageway than barrier. Arches and Bryce perch by themselves in their spectacular locations off the beaten path. Here at Capitol Reef, native people use the permanent streams running through the fold as home and as trails for 12,000 years. leaving behind cultural traces and stories. Explorers looked out from Boulder Mountain, drawing their maps, working their way through the fold. Actually, I have to point out on this map, this is a map from the Wheeler Survey in the late 1800s, and George Wheeler named Capitol Reef Impracticable Ridges on this map. Drawing their maps, working their way along the fold, working their way down the streams, through the open draws of Cathedral Valley, journaling all the way. We go to these same pathways for our hikes. And the only road across central Utah came through Capitol Reef too, right through Capitol Gorge for nearly a century. And then the Fremont Canyon Highway replaced it in 1963 with another through route. This brought travelers, and their often workers, cherished the little village of Fruta, right smack in the middle of Capitol Reef, a place with big personalities. And the old-timers who grew up there, who went to the one-room school, have often self-published their nostalgic memories of this place. Both the pioneer Mormon settlers and the eccentric misfits who retired here in the 1940s. I guess we still attract eccentric misfits to Utah, to Wayne County, and maybe even to Sanpete County. All this makes for a lot of choices for the editor of a Capitol Reef anthology. Fruta still generates both fruit from its historic orchards. You can go there in the summer and pick your own fruit. And fresh writing from younger writers like Jen Jackson Quintana, who writes of the 26 mason jars of sun-soaked Fruta apricots stored under her bed. Jeweled jars of memory, she calls them. So if you're as old as I am, and I may well be the oldest person in the room, you might recognize the spread from a book that I loved when I was in college. That calligraphed inscription on the right there says, adventure is not in the guidebook, and beauty is not on the map. Seek and ye shall find. And I pretty much have those words memorized. They come from a book called On the Loose, written by two brothers, Terry and Rennie Russell, who came to Torrey in Fruta in the summer of 1958 to hang out with their aunt and uncle, and then later explored Glen Canyon and Capitol Reef and the Sierra Nevada and the Mojave, and wrote this book about how they discovered the wilderness, a book that introduced me and a bunch of people in my generation to the wilderness. 40 years later, Rennie Russell wrote a book called Rock Me in the Water, looking back at those experiences once again, remembering meeting old-timers like Doc Inglesby in Fruta, a retired dentist, a good friend of the writer Wallace Stegner, who had a funky little motel that had stacks of big chunks of petrified wood that he gathered. Rennie Russell and his brother Terry would wander up and down the Fremont long before there was a road there, and sometimes when they got lucky, they'd be there for a flash flood. As he puts it in the book, floodwaters filthy with desire and urgency. I scoured the bookshelves down at the park library, and I just kept looking for things I didn't know about. And I found an obscure 1986 Utah State University master's thesis in history called Capitol Reef, the Forgotten National Park. The author, a guy named Jonathan Thau, T-H-O-W, had done a superb job narrating the park's history. And I wanted to use a couple of excerpts from his work, but I needed his permission. And nobody knew where to find him. He hadn't stayed in academia, so he wasn't easily visible on the web. The university didn't have any contact information for him, but they wouldn't let me reprint unless I got his permission. So I started doing detective work that took a good 2 years. And I finally found him, much to my delight. He's now a U.S. Navy judge advocate, an international law expert, and commanding officer of the Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island. So I called up the Naval Justice School, and I got one of those phone indexes where they say, punch in the first 3 letters of the person you're trying to reach. And I did that, and he called me back, and he was surprised and delighted and happy to have us reprint this relic from his past. There's controversy in the history of Capitol Reef, and I've not shied away from these stories. When Bishop Pechtold and his brother-in-law, Joseph Hickman, pushed for a Wayne Wonderland National Park to boost the Wayne County economy, what they got in 1937 was a relatively small Capitol Reef National Monument that remained unfunded for decades. and was even open to uranium mining in the 1950s. When Park Superintendent Bob Hyder drew boundaries in the late 1960s to expand that small monument sixfold in 1968, he asked his wife to secretly type up his proposal because his secretary at Capitol Reef was Afton Taylor, wife of Wayne County rancher Don Taylor, who was president of the Wayne County Cattlemen's Association, and Hyder didn't want to blow his cover. President Lyndon Johnson made that map real when he signed an executive order while dressing for Richard Nixon's inauguration. The proposal was carried to him by Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, and LBJ made that one of his very last official acts, essentially signing the executive order expanding Capitol Reef while he was putting on his pants, getting ready for the inauguration. Here in southern Utah, not everyone was pleased. Boulder Town over the mountain briefly changed its name to Johnson's Folly in protest. Nonetheless, within 2 years, Congress made Capitol Reef a national park, and the Water Pocket Fold was protected for the first time all the way south to Halls Creek Narrows. And today, 1.4 million visitors come to Capitol Reef in a single year. One of those places with a lot of controversy is a road called the Burr Trail. You can see the switchbacks going up over the fold here, and then the road wanders off toward the town of Boulder and Boulder Mountain. The road was dirt for many, many years, pioneered by the uranium prospectors in the 50s, used by the cattlemen and sheepmen. But the local counties really wanted to pave that road, and conservationists really wanted to leave it a dirt road adventure. And renegade paving has happened off and on over the years since. And today the only dirt road left is within the park. The road just outside the park in either direction is now paved. Jared Farmer, an academic and writer, tells that story in The Reader, and he talks about coming here as a kid and being astonished by the views from those switchbacks. And he also mentioned some graffiti that he had seen on one of those trips, on the bridge over the gulch on the Burr Trail. And I read his piece and thought, you know, I think I have a picture of that graffiti buried in my file somewhere. And I found it, and we used it in the book. All of this history is in The Reader, and all this history informs our lives still. I also found waiting for me on those shelves in the park library the oral histories collected by Brad Fry in the 1990s when he worked on an administrative history of the park. He had interviewed Billy Bullard and Lurt Mead, consecutive owners of the ranch on Pleasant Creek through most of the 20th century. I had interviewed both of these storytellers too, and so I was able to create standalone pieces combining stories and transcripts from both mine and Brad Fry's conversations. And as I did this, I realized I could build on these two pieces and tell the story of that ranch on Pleasant Creek, all the way down the Scenic Drive, where the Scenic Drive ends, all the way from F. Hanks, who has a descendant on your faculty, I understand, who came to the spot in 1881 and built Floral Ranch, where the Fremont had farmed as well, right through the owners who I had interviewed, Billy and Lurt, to Chip and Linda Ward, who ran Lurt's Sleeping Rainbow Guest Ranch in the 1970s. Layer after layer of recent history. And when I gave a talk at Utah Valley University, I met Kiri Manukin, who ran writing workshops for the Utah Valley University Field Station, opened on that same spot in 2008. She enthusiastically shared work from 3 awestruck international students from Ukraine, Saudi Arabia, and Mali, who were trying to make sense of Capitol Reef as wide-eyed first-timers and English language learners. This progression of pieces about the same spot in Pleasant Creek that spanned nearly 140 years is one of my favorites in the book. Wayne County nourishes its own community of resident creative folk. And I love the chance to include this picture, for one thing. When I showed the picture to a group of folks down in Wayne County, one of the local men came up to me afterwards and said, "How'd you get that picture of me?" And it was a picture I took of a cattle drive going down the Scenic Drive back in the 70s. And this was Dick Pace, who still runs cattle in Wayne County, and recognized himself and told me that the name of the horse is Cheese. So I was able to include a cowboy poem from our poet laureate, Ray Conrad, and illustrate it with the portrait of another rancher, both Ray and White in their 90s. I included a hiking narrative from Red Rock Adventure Guide, Steve Howe, an essay by Chip Ward, and I decided to include a quick survey of artists in Capitol Reef, which gave me the chance to include a photograph by Guy Tall, who lives in Torrey and runs a lot of photo workshops, fine photographer, and a Doug Snow painting, our resident painter for many, many years, who painted from his home at the base of the Coxcomb and painted this gigantic picture of Capitol Reef with lifting clouds that is actually on the wall of the Utah Supreme Court in Salt Lake City. And other photographers who came here year after year. Bruce Barnbaum, who took gorgeous black and white, high contrast images. And my favorite, Moonrise Over Pie Plate by John Fall. John Fall put a pie plate in the foreground on the night of the full moon with just about the same size and reflectivity as the moon up in the sky. And not long ago, I went looking to see if I could find where he took this picture to recreate it. And I was able to find the spot, but my dog bowl didn't work quite as well as his pie plate. I was able to also pay tribute to the great conservation photographers of the 20th century. Philip Hyde, who took photographs along the Water Pocket Fold for the Sierra Club book Slick Rock, with text by Ed Abbey, and Elliot Porter, who actually came to Capitol Reef when I was working there. And one day he walked into the visitor center and told me who he was, one of my heroes, and said he was photographing for a book that was going to have text by Wallace Stegner, and where should he go? And so as a young whippersnapper of a ranger, I got to send him off to Fountain Tanks, and was convinced when I finally saw the book in print, a book called American Places, and found this photograph that he must have taken it because I sent him there. But when we got permission to use the picture from the Elliot Porter archive, it was captioned 1963, not 1975. I think it was miscaptioned. I discovered James Swenson's work on the history of photography in Utah National Parks when he gave a talk at the Entrada Institute in Torrey several years ago. James teaches the history of photography at BYU, and he turned his talk into an original piece for the reader about Minor White. Minor White was the same generation as Ansel Adams, who took those glorious pictures on the wall over there. But he tended to work in much more abstract ways. And he loved Capitol Reef. He loved the weird rock in Capitol Reef. And on one of his trips, he took this picture that James calls the most famous picture ever taken at Capitol Reef. You'll likely find it in most any survey of 20th century American photography. An abstract black and white of Moen Kopi sandstone. And I keep looking for it. I keep my eye out for that particular chunk of rock, probably maybe 4 feet across, but I have yet to spot it. And I may never spot it. I likely won't, but it's fun to look for it. I've realized that the first question I get about the reader is, how did I find all this cool material? Work from nearly 50 writers. My bedrock for building the reader is the stuff I read when I first arrived here. Work from writers whose names, most of whom you've already heard tonight. Wallace Stegner, Clarence Dutton, Ed Abbey, Ann Swinger. My other starting point, the bookshelf of works published by the Capitol Reef Natural History Association over the years. I asked my fellow writers, my colleagues, scholars, regional experts, I asked them all for advice. Did they have anything to suggest? What would they include? Had they written anything about Capitol Reef I wasn't aware of? I'm a natural history writer, and so I could look through the work of my friends and colleagues to find great writing about Capitol Reef. Amazon.com turns out to be a great research tool as well. The company may be taking over the world, but they are thorough. Maybe that's why they are taking over the world. I searched for books on the Amazon website using every keyword I could think of. Capitol Reef, Water Pocket Fold, Fruita, Wayne County, Boulder Mountain, Aquarius Plateau, Henry Mountains. You get the idea. And whenever I got results, I would work through them to the very, very last page. And that's how I found some things that were self-published that I would not have known about in any other way. In my searching, I found Gary Ferguson's book, Shouting at the Sky, based on time he spent around Capitol Reef with kids enrolled in the Aspen Institute's Wilderness Therapy program. He described his fieldwork for the book as the most significant personal experience I've ever had. His description of a night in the Red Desert is one of my favorite passages in the Reader. He writes, "The full moon spilling down the shoulders of Caneville Reef, across the long flat sweeps of sage and rabbit brush and greasewood, through a thin braid of dry, nameless washes, onto the faces of 7 teenage girls scattered across the ground at the edge of a box canyon, hoping for sleep." To illustrate Gary's piece, I went out to photograph that same full moon spilling across the Red Desert late one summer night. And it was absolutely exhilarating to be out there alone in the middle of nowhere, the desert bright by moonlight under a canopy of stars. And Holly was telling me about your photography class who did something similar over at Dead Horse Point, so you know what I mean. I was determined to include Ellen Malloy, Utah's best writer, who died much too soon in 2004. When Ellen walked along the Navajo sandstone spine of Cone Ridge, outside her home in Bluff, and wrote about the slick erotica of Indian paintbrush and cliff roads in spring, she could just as easily have been writing about the Navajo sandstone spine of the Water Pocket Fold. So I was able to use her smart, funny, and gorgeous prose. I skimmed each new book to find passages to excerpt, scanned these pages, and plopped the new piece on my pile. I shuffled these into themes. I had to eliminate some, go back to searching for others to fill gaps, shorten many. Nearly every writer proved generous and cooperative. The highest reprint fees actually came from the publishers and agents managing the legacies of deceased authors, where I had no chance to plead nonprofit publisher poverty with the writer herself. At the same time, the book pushed me into organizing my thousands of photos from the park, taken over these last decades. Once I had all those slides pulled together and all those digital images in their place on my hard drive, I began editing, choosing not just my favorites, but images that I knew would best illustrate my excerpts. I searched the files at the park, at the Utah Historical Society, and at Marriott Library at the University of Utah for maps and historic images like this picture of Dewey Gifford pulling a hapless tourist out of the mud one spring. I created a portfolio section so I could feature a few of my pictures that one might call art, details and landscapes that are more pure graphic and light than illustration. And I began that portfolio, as I often begin talks about the Colorado Plateau, with this picture, which to me captures the feel of this quote from Willa Cather. "This really is the bright edge of the world." And then I went on to include a few details and pictures that didn't really match any of the excerpts, but pictures that I loved that I wanted to include, including pictures of just playing, running down the spine of those Mako Shale Badlands. As with any book, once I had a draft, I gave the manuscript to friends and colleagues for review. You need great readers, and when you find a good reader, hold them tight, never let them go. The park superintendent, local historians, smart friends, the general editor of the series all gave me invaluable advice. I used my prerogative as editor to close the reader with my own words. I chose an excerpt from the last chapter in my book, Bargaining for Eden, where I do my best to figure out Wayne County, this classic small town, long winter, droughty summer, western challenge. I end both the reader and Bargaining for Eden with a credo. I wrote this piece more than a decade ago when I tried to boil down into a bulleted list what I believed about land, community, and honor after 50-odd years of living in the Imperial West and learning from the past, from my mentors, from the stories of impassioned advocates on all sides, from the mountains, from the mesa, a statement too of my dreams for the future. When you read the book, you'll have to judge if I've done so fairly. So I hope the Capitol Reef Reader serves as a primer to this place so many of us love, an introduction to an incredibly rich literature created over many decades, a celebration of our home. Thank you.